Hello, and welcome to BigBookCTK.com. My name is Tusney, and today I'm reading from Les Misérables by Victor Hugo. Book the first, A Just Man. Chapter 1, Monsieur Myriel. In 1815, Monsieur Charles François Bienvenu Myriel was bishop. He was an old man of about 75 years of age. He had occupied the see since 1806. Although this detail has no connection whatever with the real substance of what we're about to relate, it will not be superfluous. It's merely for the sake of exactness in all points to mention here the various rumors and remarks which had been in circulation about him from the very moment when he arrived in the diocese. True or false, that which is said of men often occupies as important a place in their lives, and above all in their destinies, as that which they do. Monsieur Myriel was the son of a councillor of the Parliament of Aix. Hence he belonged to the nobility of the Bar. It was said that his father, destined him to be the heir of his own post, had married him at a very early age, 18 or 20, in accordance with a custom which is rather widely prevalent in parliamentary families. In spite of this marriage, however, it was said that Charles Myriel created a great deal of talk. He was well-formed, though rather short in stature, elegant, graceful, intelligent. The whole of the first portion of his life has been devoted to the world and to gallantry. The revolution came. Events succeeded each other with precipitation. The parliamentary family, decimated, pursued, hunted down, were dispersed. Monsieur Charles Myriel emigrated to Italy at the very beginning of the revolution. There his wife died of a malady of the chest, from which she had long suffered. He had no children. What took place next in the fate of Monsieur Myriel? The ruin of the French society of the olden days, the fall of his own family, the tragic spectacles of '93, which were, perhaps, even more alarming to the emigrants who viewed them from a distance, with the magnifying powers of terror. Did these cause the ideas of renunciation and solitude to germinate in him? Was he, in the midst of these distractions, these affections which absorbed his life, suddenly smitten with one of those mysterious and terrible blows which sometimes overwhelm, by striking to his heart? A man whom public catastrophes would not shake, by striking at his existence and his fortune? No one could have told. All that was known was that when he returned from Italy, he was a priest. In 1804, Monsieur Myriel was the curé of Grignon. He was already advanced in years and lived in a very retired manner. After the epoch of the coronation, some petty affair connected with his curacy, just what is not precisely known, took him to Paris. Among other powerful persons to whom he went to solicit aid for his parishioners was Monsieur le Cardinal Fesch. One day, when the emperor had come to visit his uncle, the worthy curé, who was waiting in the anteroom, found himself present when his majesty passed. Napoleon, on finding himself observed with a certain curiosity by this old man, turned round and said abruptly, "Who is this good man who is staring at me?" "Sire," said Monsieur Myriel, "you are looking at a good man, and I at a great man. Each of us can profit by it." That very evening, the emperor asked the cardinal the name of the curé, and some time afterwards, Monsieur Myriel was utterly astonished to learn that he had been appointed bishop. What truth was there, after all, in the stories which were invented as the early portion of Monsieur Myriel's life? No one knew. Very few families had been acquainted with the Myriel family before the Revolution. Monsieur Myriel had to undergo the fate of every newcomer in a little town, where there are many mouths which talk, and very few heads which think. He was obliged to undergo it all, although he was a bishop, and because he was a bishop. But after all, The rumors with which his name was connected were rumors only, noise, sayings, words, less than words, palabres, as the energetic language of the South expresses it. However that may be, after 9 years of episcopal power and of residence, all the stories and subjects of conversation which engrossed petty towns and petty people at the outset had fallen into profound oblivion. No one would have dared to mention them. No one would have dared to recall them. Monsieur Myriel had arrived, accompanied by an elderly spinster, Mademoiselle Baptistine, who was his sister, and 10 years his junior. Their only domestic was a female servant of the same age as Mademoiselle Baptistine, and named Madame Magloire, who, after having been a servant of Monsieur le Curé, now assumed the double title of maid to Mademoiselle and housekeeper to Monseigneur. Mademoiselle Baptistine was a long, pale, thin, gentle creature. She realized the ideal expressed by the word respectable, for it seems that a woman must needs be a mother in order to be venerable. She had never been pretty. Her whole life, which had been nothing but a succession of holy deeds, had finally conferred upon her a sort of pallor and transparency, and as she advanced in years, she had acquired what may be called the beauty of goodness. What had been meanness in her youth had become transparency in her maturity, and this diaphanity allowed the angel to be seen. She was a soul rather than a virgin. Her person seemed made of a shadow. There was hardly sufficient body to provide for sex, a little matter enclosing a light, large eyes forever drooping, a mere pretext for a soul remaining on the earth. Madame Magloire was a little, fat, white old woman, corpulent and bustling, always out of breath, in the first place because of her activity, and in the next because of her asthma. On his arrival, Monsieur Myriel was installed in the episcopal palace with the honors required by the imperial decree, which classed a bishop immediately after a major general. The mayor and the president paid the first call on him, and he, in turn, paid the first call on the general and the prefect. Their installation over, the town waited to see its bishop at work. Chapter 2. Monseigneur Myriel becomes Monseigneur Welcome. The episcopal palace adjoins the hospital. The episcopal palace was a huge and beautiful house, built of stone at the beginning of the last century by Monsieur Henri Puget, Doctor of Theology of the Faculty of Paris, Abbé of Simon, who had been bishop in 1712. This palace was a genuine seigneurial residence. Everything about it had a grand air. The apartments of the bishop, the drawing rooms, the chambers, the principal courtyard, which was very large, and with walks encircling it under arcades in the old Florentine fashion, and gardens planted with magnificent trees. In the dining room, a long and superb gallery, which is situated on the ground floor and open on the garden. Monsieur Henri Puget had entertained in state on July the 29th, 1714. My Lord Charles Brûlard de Genlis, Archbishop, Prince d'Ambrun, Antoine de Mesrenier, de Capuchin, Bishop of Grasse, Philippe de Vendôme, Prior France, Abbé of Saint-Honore de Lorraine, François de Béton de Crayon, Bishop, Baron de Vence, César de Sabrin de Forcalquier, Bishop, Seigneur of Glandes, and Jean Soinen, priest of the Oratory, preaching ordinary to the king, Bishop, Seigneur of Senez. The portraits of the 7 reverend personages decorated this apartment, and this memorable date the 29th of July, 1714, was there engraved in letters of gold on a table of white marble. The hospital was a low and narrow building of a single story with a small garden. 3 days after his arrival, the bishop visited the hospital. The visit ended. He had the director requested to be so good as to come to his house. Monsieur the director of the hospital, said he to him, how many sick people have you at the present moment? 26, Monseigneur. That was the number which I counted, said the bishop. The beds, pursued the director, are very much crowded against each other. That is what I observed. The halls are nothing but rooms, and it is with difficulty that the air can be changed in them. So it seems to me. And then, when there is a ray of sun, the garden is very small for the convalescent. That is what I said to myself. In case of epidemics, we have had the typhus fever this year, we had the sweating sickness 2 years ago, and 100 patients at times. We know not what to do. That is the thoughts which occur to me. What would you have, Monseigneur? Said the director. One must resign oneself. This conversation took place in the gallery dining room on the ground floor. The bishop remained silent for a moment. Then he turned abruptly to the director of the hospital. Monsieur, said he, how many beds do you think this hall alone could hold? Monseigneur's dining room? Exclaimed the stupefied director. The bishop cast a glance round the apartment and seemed to be taking measures and calculations with his eyes. It would hold full 20 beds, said he, as though speaking to himself. Then, raising his voice, hold, Monsieur the director of the hospital, I will tell you something. There is evidently a mistake here. There are 36 of you in 5 or 6 small rooms. There are 3 of us here, and we have room for 60. There is some mistake, I tell you. You have my house, and I have yours. Give me back my house. You are at home here. On the following day, the 36 patients were installed in the bishop's palace, and the bishop was installed in the hospital. Monsieur Misérables had no property. His family having been ruined by the revolution, his sister was in receipt of a yearly income of 500 francs, which sufficed for her personal wants at the vicarage. Monsieur Misérables received from the state, in his quality of bishop, a salary of 15,000 francs. On the very day when he took up his abode in the hospital, Monsieur Misérables settled on the disposition of this sum once for all in the following manner. We transcribe here a note made by his own hand. Note on the regulations of my household expenses. For the little seminary, 1,500 livres. Society of the Mission, 100 livres. For the Lazarist of Montdidier, 100 livres. Seminaries for foreign missions in Paris, 200 livres. Congregation of the Holy Spirit, 150 livres. Religious establishments of the Holy Land, 100 livres. Extra for that of Arles, 50 livres. Charitable maternity societies, 300 livres. Work for the amelioration of prisons, 400 livres. Work for the relief and delivery of prisoners, 500 livres. To liberate fathers of families incarcerated for debt, 1,000 livres. Addition to the salary of the poor teachers of the diocese, 2,000 livres. Public Gallery of the Haute Arts, 100 livres. Congregation of the Ladies of Manosque and of Sisteron for the gratuitous instruction of poor girls, 1,500 livres. For the poor, 6,000 livres. My personal expenses, 1,000 livres. Total, 15,000 livres. Monseigneur Misérables made no change in this arrangement during the entire period that he occupied the state. As has been seen, he called it regulating his household expenses. This arrangement was accepted with absolute submission by Mademoiselle Baptistine. This holy woman regarded Monseigneur as at one and the same time her brother and her bishop, her friend according to her flesh, and her superior according to the church. She simply loved and venerated him. When he spoke, she bowed. When he acted, she yielded her adherence. Their only servant, Madame Magloire, grumbled a little. It will be observed that Monsieur the Bishop had reserved for himself only 1,000 livres, which, added to the pension of Mademoiselle Baptistine, made 1,500 francs a year. On these 1,500 francs, these two old women and the old man subsisted. And when a village curate came, the bishop still found means to entertain him, thanks to the severe economy of Madame Magloire and to the intelligent administration of Mademoiselle Baptistine. One day, after he'd been there about 3 months, the bishop said, "And still I'm quite cramped with it all." "I should think so," exclaimed Madame Magloire. "Monseigneur has not even claimed the allowance which the department owes him for the expense of his carriage in town, and for his journeys about the diocese. It was customary for bishops in former days." "Oh," cried the bishop, "you are quite right, Madame Magloire," and he made his demand. Some time afterwards, the General Council took this demand under consideration and voted him an annual sum of 3,000 francs. Under this heading, allowance to Monseigneur the Bishop for expenses of carriage, expenses of posting, and expenses of pastoral visits. This provoked a great outcry among the local burgesses, and a senator of the Empire, a local member of the Council of the 500, which favored the 18 Brumaire, and who was provided with a magnificent senatorial office in the vicinity of the town, wrote to Monsieur Bigot de Prémeneur, the Minister of Public Worship, a very angry and confidential note on the subject, from which we extract these authentic lines. "Expenses of carriage? What can be done with it in a town of less than 4,000 inhabitants? Expenses of journeys? What is the use of these trips in the first place? Next, how can the posting be accomplished in these mountainous parts? There are no roads. No one travels otherwise than on horseback. Even the bridge between Durance and Château-Arnoux can barely support ox teams. These priests are all thus, greedy and avaricious. This man played the good priest when he first came. Now he does like the rest. He must have a carriage and a posting chassis. He must have luxuries like the bishops of the olden days. Oh, all this priesthood! Things will not go well, Monsieur le Comte, until the Emperor has freed us from these black-capped rascals. Down with the Pope! Matters were getting embroiled with Rome. For my part, I am for Caesar alone," etc., etc. On the other hand, this affair afforded great delight to Madame Magloire. "Good," said she to Mademoiselle Baptistine. "Monseigneur began with other people, but he has had to wind up with himself. After all, he has regulated all his charities. Now, here are 3,000 francs for us, at last." That same evening, the bishop wrote out and handed to his sister a memorandum conceived in the following terms: expenses of carriage and circuit. For furnishing meat soup to the patients in the hospital, 1,500 livres. For the Maternity Charitable Society of Aix, 250 livres. For the Maternity Charitable Society of Jaguignon, 250 livres. For foundlings, 500 livres. For orphans, 500 livres. Total, 3,000 livres. Such was Monseigneur Misérables' budget. As for the chance episcopal perquisites, the fees for marriage bans, dispensations, private baptisms, sermons, benedictions of churches or chapels, marriages, etc., the levied them on the wealthy with all the more asperity, since he bestowed them on the needy. After a time, offerings of money flowed in. Those who had and those who lacked knocked at Monseigneur Michel's door, the latter in search of the alms which the former came to deposit. In less than a year, the bishop had become the treasurer of all the benevolence and the cashier of all those in distress. Considerable sums of money passed through his hands, but nothing could induce him to make any change whatever in his mode of life, or add anything superfluous to his bare necessities. Far from it. As there is always more wretchedness below than there is brotherhood above, all was given away, so to speak, before it was received. It was like water on dry soil. No matter how much money he received, he never had any. Then he stripped himself. The usage means that bishops shall announce their baptismal names at the head of their charges and their pastoral letters. The poor people of the countryside had selected, with a sort of affectionate instinct, among the names and prenomens of their bishop, that which had a meaning for them, and they never called him anything except Monseigneur Bienvenu, welcome. We will follow their example, and will also call him thus when we have occasion to name him. Moreover, this appellation pleased him. I like that name, said he. Bienvenu makes up for the Monseigneur. We do not claim that the portrait herewith presented is probable. We confine ourselves to stating that it resembles the original. Chapter 3. A hard bishopric for a good bishop. The bishop did not omit his pastoral visits because he had converted his carriage into arms. The diocese of Durand is a fatiguing one. There are very few plains and a great many mountains. Hardly any roads, as we have just seen. 32 curacies, 41 vicarships, and 285 auxiliary chapels. To visit all these is quite a task. The bishop managed to do it. He went on foot when it was in the neighborhood, in a tilted spring cart when it was on the plain, and on a donkey in the mountains. The two old women accompanied him. When the trip was too hard for them, he went alone. One day he arrived at Senez, which is an ancient episcopal city. He was mounted on an ass. His purse, which was very dry at that moment, did not permit him any other equipage. The mayor of the town came to receive him at the gate of the town, and watched him dismount from his ass with scandalized eyes. Some of the citizens were laughing around him. Monsieur the Mayor, said the bishop, and Messieurs citizens, I perceive that I shocked you. You think it very arrogant in a poor priest to ride an animal which was used by Jesus Christ. I have done so from necessity, I assure you, and not from vanity. In the course of these trips, he was kind and indulgent, and talked rather than preached. He never went far in search of his arguments and his examples. He quoted to the inhabitants of one district the example of a neighboring district. In the cantons where they were harsh to the poor, he said, look at the people of Briançon. They have conferred on the poor, on widows and orphans, the right to have their meadows mown 3 days in advance of everyone else. They rebuild their houses for them gratuitously when they are ruined. Therefore, it is a country which is blessed by God. For a whole century, there has not been a single murderer amongst them. The villages which were grieved for profit and harvest, he said, look at the people of Embrun. If, at the harvest season, the father of a family has his son away on service in the army, and his daughters at service in the town, and if he is ill and incapacitated, the curé recommends him to the prayers of the congregation, and on Sunday, after the Mass, all the inhabitants of the village, men, women, and children, go to the poor man's field and do his harvesting for him, and carry his straw and his grain to his granary. To families divided by questions of money and inheritance, he said, look at the mountaineers of Devonny, a country so wild that the nightingale is not heard there once in 50 years. Well, when the father of a family dies, The boys go off to seek their fortunes, leaving the property to the girls, so that they may find husbands. To the cantons, which had a taste for lawsuits, and where the farmers ruined themselves in stamped paper, he said, "Look at those good peasants in the valley of Queyras. There are 3,000 souls of them, mon Dieu. It is like a little republic. Neither judge nor bailiff is known there. The mayor does everything. He allots the imposts, taxes each person conscientiously, judges quarrels for nothing, divides inheritances without charge, pronounces sentences gratuitously, and he is obeyed because he is a just man among simple men." To villages where he found no schoolmaster, he quoted once more the people of Queyras. "Do you know how to manage?" he said. "Since a little country of 12 or 15 hearths cannot always support a teacher, they have schoolmasters who are paid by the whole valley, who make the round of the villages, spending a week in this one, 10 days in that, and instruct them. These teachers go to the fairs. I have seen them there. They are to be recognized by the quill pens which they wear in the cord of their hats. Those who teach reading have only one pen. Those who teach reading and reckoning have 2 pens. Those who teach reading, reckoning, and Latin have 3 pens. But what a disgrace to be ignorant. Do you like the people of Queyras?" Thus he discoursed gravely and paternally. In default of examples, he invented parables, going directly to the point, with few phrases and many images, which characteristics form the real eloquence of Jesus Christ. And being convinced himself, he was persuasive. Chapter 4. Work corresponding to work. His conversation was gay and affable. He put himself on a level with the 2 old women who had passed their lives beside him. When he laughed, it was the laugh of a schoolboy. Madame Magloire liked to call him "Your Grace," which was Handir. One day he rose from his armchair and went to his library in search of a book. This book was on one of the upper shelves. As the bishop was rather short of stature, he could not reach it. "Madame Magloire," said he, "fetch me a chair. My greatness, grand Dieu, does not reach as far as that shelf." One of his distant relatives, Madame la Comtesse de Leu, rarely allowed an opportunity to escape of enumerating in his presence what she designated as the expectations of her 3 sons. She had numerous relatives who were very old and near to death, and of whom her son was the natural heir. The youngest of the 3 was to receive from a grand aunt a good 100,000 livres of income. The second was the heir by entail to the title of the duke. His uncle, the eldest, was to succeed to the peerage of his grandfather. The bishop was accustomed to listen in silence to these innocent and pardonable maternal boasts. On one occasion, however, he appeared to be more thoughtful than usual. While Madame de Leu was relating once again the details of all these inheritances and all these expectations, she interrupted herself impatiently. "Mon Dieu, cousin, what are you thinking about?" "I am thinking," replied the bishop, "of a singular remark which is to be found, I believe, in St. Augustine. Place your hopes in the man from whom you do not inherit." At another time, on receiving a notification of the decease of a gentleman of the countryside, wearing not only the dignities of the dead man, but also the feudal and noble qualifications of all his relatives spread over an entire page. "What a stout back death has!" he exclaimed. "What a strange burden of titles is cheerfully imposed on him, and how much wit must men have in order thus to press the tomb into the service of vanity." He was gifted on occasion with a gentle raillery which almost always concealed a serious meaning. In the course of one Lent, a youthful figure came to Durand and preached in the cathedral. He was tolerably eloquent. sermon was charity. He urged the rich to give to the poor in order to avoid hell, which he depicted in the most frightful manner of which he was capable, and to win paradise, which he represented as charming and desirable. Among the audience there was a wealthy retired merchant who was somewhat of a usurer named Monsieur Geberan, who had amassed 2 millions in the manufacture of coarse cloth, serges, and woolen galloons. Never in his whole life had Monsieur Geberan bestowed alms on any poor wretch. After the delivery of that sermon, it was observed that he gave a sou every Sunday to the poor old beggar women at the door of the cathedral. There were 6 of them to share it. One day the bishop caught sight of him in the act of bestowing this charity, and said to his sister with a smile, "There is Monsieur Geberan purchasing paradise for a sou." When it was a question of charity, he was not to be rebuffed, even by a refusal, and on such occasions he gave utterance to remarks which induced reflection. Once he was begging for the poor in a drawing-room of the town. There was present the Marquis de Champtecier, a wealthy and avaricious old man, who contrived to be, at one and the same time, an ultra-royalist and an ultra-Voltairian. This variety of man has actually existed. When the bishop came to him, he touched his arm. "You must give me something, Monsieur le Marquis." The Marquis turned round and answered dryly, "I have poor people of my own, Monseigneur." "Give them to me," replied the bishop. One day he preached the following sermon in the cathedral: "My very dear brethren, my good friends, there are 1,320,000 peasants dwelling in France, which have but 3 openings, 1,817,000 hovels, which have but 2 openings, a door and 1 window, and 346,000 cabins, besides which have but 1 opening, the door. And this arises from a sin which is called the tax on doors and windows. Just put poor families, old women, and little children in those buildings, and behold the fevers and maladies which result. Alas, God gives air to men, the law sells it to them. I do not blame the law, but I bless God. In the department of the Isère, in the Var, in the 2 departments of the Alps, the Haute, and the Basque, the peasants have not even wheelbarrows. They transport their manure on the backs of men. They have no candles, and they burn resinous sticks and bits of rope dipped in pitch. That is the state of affairs throughout the whole of the hilly country of Dauphine. They make bread for 6 months at one time. They bake it with dried cow dung. In the winter, they break this bread up with an axe, and they soak it for 24 hours in order to render it eatable. My brethren, have pity. Behold the suffering on all sides of you. Born a Provençal, he easily familiarized himself with the dialect of the south. He said, "En bé, monsieur, c'est sage?" as in Lower Languedoc. "On te anara passa?" as in the Basse Alpes. "Piote en Bloine montu and en Provence fromage gras?" as in Upper Dauphin. This pleased the people extremely, and contributed not a little to winning access to all spirits. He was perfectly at home in the thatched cottage, and in the mountains. He understood how to say the grandest things in the most vulgar of idioms. As he spoke all tongues, he entered into all hearts. Moreover, he was the same towards the people of the world and towards the lower classes. He condemned nothing in haste, and without taking circumstances into account. He said, "Examine the road over which the faith has passed." Being, as he described himself with a smile, an ex-sinner, he had none of the asperities of austerity, and he professed, with a good deal of distinctness, and without the frown of the ferociously virtuous, a doctrine which may be summed up as follows: "Man has upon him his flesh, which is at once his burden and his temptation. He drags it with him and yields to it. He must watch it, check it, repress it, and obey it only at the last extremity. There may be some fault even in this obedience, but the fault thus committed is venial. It is a fall, but a fall on the knees, which may terminate in prayer. To be a saint is the exception. To be an upright man is the rule. Fall, sin if you will, but be upright. The least possible sin is the law of man. No sin at all is the dream of the angel. All of which is terrestrial is subject to sin. Sin is a gravitation. When he saw everyone exclaiming very loudly, and growing angry very quickly, "Oh, oh," he said with a smile, "to all appearance this is a great crime which all the world commits. These are hypocrisies which have taken fright, and are in haste to make protest, and to put themselves under shelter, towards indulgence, towards women and poor people, on whom the burden of human society rests." He said, "The faults of women, of children, of the feeble, the indigent, and the ignorant, are the faults of the husbands, the fathers, the masters, the strong, the rich, and the wise." He said, moreover, "Teach those who are ignorant as many things as possible. Society is culpable in that it does not afford instruction gratis. It is responsible for the night which it produces. This soul is full of shadows. Sin is therein committed. The guilty one is not the person who has committed no sin, but the person who has created the shadow. It will be perceived that he had a peculiar manner of his own of judging things. I suspect that he obtained it from the gospel. One day he heard a criminal case, which was in preparation and on the point of trial, discussed in a drawing room. A wretched man, being at the end of his resources, had coined counterfeit money out of love for a woman and for the child which he had had by her. Counterfeiting was still punishable with death at that point. At that epoch, the woman had been arrested in the act of passing the first false piece made by the man. She was held, but there were no proofs except against her. She alone could accuse her lover and destroy him by her confession. She denied, they insisted. She persisted in her denial. Thereupon an idea occurred to the attorney for the crown. He invented an infidelity on the part of the lover and succeeded by means of fragments of letters cunningly presented in persuading the unfortunate woman that she had a rival and that the man was deceiving her. Thereupon, exasperated by jealousy, she denounced her lover, confessed all, proved all. The man was ruined. He was shortly to be tried at Aix with his accomplice. They were relating the matter, and each one was expressing enthusiasm over the cleverness of the magistrate. By bringing jealousy into play, he had caused the troops to burst forth in wrath. He had educed the justice of revenge. The bishop listened to all this in silence. When they had finished, he inquired, "Where are this man and woman to be tried?" "At the court of assizes," he went on. "And where will the advocate of the crown be tried?" A tragic event occurred at Durand. A man was condemned to death for murder. He was a wretched fellow, not exactly educated, not exactly ignorant, who had been a mountebank at fairs and a writer for the public. The town took a great interest in the trial. On the eve of the day fixed for the execution of the condemned man, the chaplain of the prison fell ill. A priest was needed to attend the criminal in his last moments. They sent for the curé. It seems that he refused to come, saying, "That is no affair of mine. I have nothing to do with that unpleasant task." And with that bounced back, "I too am ill, and besides, it is not my place." This reply was reported to the bishop, who said, "Monsieur le curé is right. It is not his place, it is mine." He went instantly to the prison. descended to the cell of the mountebank, called him by name, took him by the hand, and spoke to him. He passed the entire day with him, forgetful of food and sleep, praying to God for the soul of the condemned man, and praying the condemned man for his own. He told him the best truths, which are also the most simple. He was father, brother, friend. He was bishop, only to bless. He taught him everything, encouraged and consoled him. The man was on the point of dying in despair. Death was an abyss to him. As he stood trembling on its mournful brink, he recoiled with horror. He was not sufficiently ignorant to be absolutely indifferent. His condemnation, which had been a profound shock, had, in a manner, broken through, here and there, that wall which separates us from the mystery of things, and which we call life. He gazed incessantly beyond this world through these fatal breaches, and beheld only darkness. The bishop made him see light. On the following day, when they came to fetch the unhappy wretch, the bishop was still there. He followed him and exhibited himself to the eyes of the crowd in his purple camel and with his episcopal cross upon his neck, side by side with the criminal bound with cords. He mounted the tumbrel with him. He mounted the scaffold with him. The sufferer, who had been so gloomy and cast down on the preceding day, was radiant. He felt that his soul was reconciled, and he hoped in God. The bishop embraced him, and at the moment when the knife was about to fall, he said to him, God raises from the dead him whom man slays. He whom his brothers have rejected finds his Father once more. Pray, believe, enter into life. The Father is there. When he descended from the scaffold, there was something in his look which made the people draw aside to let him pass. They did not know which was most worthy of admiration, his pallor or his serenity. On his return to the humble dwelling, which he designated with a smile as his palace, he said to his sister, I have just officiated pontifically. Since the most sublime things are often those which are the least understood, there were people in the town who said, when commenting on this conduct of the bishop, it is affectation. This, however, which was a remark which was confined to the drawing room. The populace, which perceived no jest in holy deeds, was touched and admired him. As for the bishop, it was a shock to him to have beheld the guillotine, and it was a long time before he recovered from it. In fact, when the scaffold is there, all erected and prepared, it has something about it which produces hallucinations. One may feel a certain indifference to the death penalty. One may refrain from pronouncing upon it, from saying yes or no, so long as one has not seen a guillotine with one's own eyes. But if one encounters one of them, the shock is violent. One is forced to decide and to take part for or against. Some admire it, like Demers. Others execrate it, like Beccaria. The guillotine is the concretion of the law. It is called bandit. It is not neutral, and it does not permit you to remain neutral. He who sees it shivers with the most mysterious of shivers. All social problems erect their interrogation point around this chopping knife. The scaffold is a vision. The scaffold is not a piece of carpentry. The scaffold is not a machine. The scaffold is not an inert bit of mechanism constructed of wood, iron, and cord. It seems as though it were a being, possessed of I know not what somber initiative. One would say that this piece of carpenter's work saw, that this machine heard, that this mechanism understood, that this wood, this iron, and these cords were possessed of will. In the frightful meditation into which its presence casts the soul, the scaffold appears in terrible guise, and as though taking part in what is going on, the scaffold is the accomplice of the executioner. It devours, it eats flesh, it drinks blood. The scaffold is a sort of monster fabricated by the judge and the carpenter, a spectre which seems to live with a horrible vitality composed of all the death which it has inflicted. Therefore, the impression was terrible and profound. On the day following the execution, and on many succeeding days, the bishop appeared to be crushed. The almost violent serenity of the funereal moment had disappeared. The phantom of social injustice tormented him. He, who generally returned from all his deeds with a radiant satisfaction, seemed to be reproaching himself. At times he talked to himself and stammered lugubrious monologues in a low voice. This is one which his sister overheard one evening and preserved. I did not think that it was so monstrous. It is wrong to become absorbed in the divine law to such a degree as not to perceive human law. Death belongs to God alone. By what right do men touch that unknown thing? In course of time, these observations weakened and probably vanished. Nevertheless, it was observed that the bishop thenceforth avoided passing the place of execution. Monsignor Muriel could be summoned at any hour to the bedside of the sick and dying. He did not ignore the fact that therein lay his greatest duty and his greatest labour. Widowed and orphaned families had no need to summon him. He came of his own accord. He understood how to sit down and hold his peace for long hours beside the man who had lost the wife of his love, of the mother who had lost her child. As he knew the moment for silence, he knew also the moment for speech. O admirable consoler! He sought not to efface sorrow by forgetfulness, but to magnify and dignify it by hope. He said, have a care of the manner in which you turn towards the dead. Think not of that which perishes. Gaze steadily, you will perceive the living light of your well-beloved dead in the depths of heaven. He knew that faith is wholesome. He sought to counsel and calm the despairing man by pointing out to him the resigned man, and to transform the grief which gazes upon a grave by showing him the grief which fixes its gaze upon a star. Chapter 5. Monseigneur Bienvenu made his cassocks last too long. The private life of Monseigneur Muriel was filled with the same thoughts as his public life. The voluntary poverty in which the Bishop of Durance lived would have been a solemn and charming sight for anyone who could have viewed it close at hand. Like all old men, and like the majority of thinkers, he slept little. This brief slumber was profound. In the morning he meditated for an hour, then he said his Mass, either at the cathedral or in his own house. His Mass said, he broke his fast on rye bread dipped in the milk of his own cow. Then he set to work. A bishop is a very busy man. He must every day receive the secretary of the bishopric, who is generally a canon, and nearly every day his vicars general. He has congregations to reprove, privileges to grant, a whole ecclesiastical library to examine, prayer books, diocesan catechisms, books of hours, etc., charges to write, sermons to authorize, curates and mayors to reconcile, a clerical correspondence and administrative correspondence, on one side the state, on the other the holy saints, and 1,000 matters of business. What time was left to him after these 1,000 details of business, and his offices, and his breviary? He bestowed first on the necessitous, the sick, and the afflicted. The time which was left to him from the afflicted, the sick, and the necessitous, he devoted to work. Sometimes he dug in his garden. Again, he read or wrote. He had but one word for both these kinds of toil. He called them gardening. The mind is a garden, said he. Towards midday, when the weather was fine, he went forth and took a stroll in the country or in town, often entering lowly dwellings. He was seen walking alone, buried in his own thoughts, his eyes cast down, supporting himself on his long cane, clad in his wadded purple garment of silk, which was very warm, wearing purple stockings inside his coarse shoes, and surmounted by a flat hat which allowed 3 golden tassels of large bullion to droop from its 3 points. It was a perfect festival wherever he appeared. One would have said that his presence had something warming and luminous about it. The bishop, the children, and the old people came out to the doorsteps for the bishop, as for the son. He bestowed his blessing, and they blessed him. They pointed out his house to anyone who was in need of anything. Here and there he halted, accosted the little boys and girls, and smiled upon the mothers. He visited the poor so long as he had any money. When he no longer had any, he visited the rich. As he made his cassock last a long while and did not wish to have it noticed, he never went out in the town without his wadded purple cloak. This inconvenienced him somewhat in summer. On his return he dined. The dinner resembled his breakfast. At 8:30 in the evening he supped with his sister, Madame Magloire, standing behind them and serving them at table. Nothing could be more frugal than this repast. If, however, the bishop had one of his curés to supper, Madame Magloire took advantage of the opportunity to serve Monseigneur with some excellent fish from the lake, or with some fine game from the mountains. Every curé furnished a pretext for a good meal. The bishop did not interfere. Without exception, his ordinary diet consisted only of vegetables boiled in water and oil soup. Thus it was said in the town, when the bishop does not indulge in the cheer of a curé, he indulges in the cheer of a Trappist. After supper, he conversed for half an hour with Mademoiselle Baptistine and Madame Magloire. Then he retired to his own room and set to writing, sometimes on loose sheets, and again on the margin of some folio. He was a man of letters and rather learned. He left behind him 5 or 6 very curious manuscripts, among others a dissertation on this verse in Genesis. In the beginning, the Spirit of God floated upon the waters. With this verse, he compares 3 texts. The Arabic verse, which says, the wind of God blew, Flavius Josephus, who says, a wind from above was precipitated upon the earth, and finally, the Chaldaic paraphrase of Onkelos, which renders it, a wind coming from God blew upon the face of the waters. In another dissertation, he examines the theological works of Hugo, Bishop of Ptolemais, great-granduncle to the writer of this book, and establishes the fact that to this bishop must be attributed the diverse little works published during the last century under the pseudonym of Barley Court. Sometimes, in the midst of his reading, no matter what the book might be which he had in his hand, he would suddenly fall into profound meditation, whence he only emerged to write a few lines on the pages of the volume itself. These lines have often no connection whatever with the book which contains them. We now have under our eyes a note written by him on the margin of a quarto entitled Correspondence of Lord Germain with Generals Clinton, Cornwallis, and the Admiral on the American station, Versailles, Poincourt, bookseller, and Paris, Puceau, bookseller, Quai des Augustins. Here is the note. Oh, you who are. Ecclesiastes calls you the all-powerful. The Maccabees call you the Creator. The Epistle to the Ephesians calls you liberty. Baruch calls you immensity. The Psalms call you wisdom and truth. John calls you light. The books of Kings call you Lord. Exodus calls you providence. Leviticus, sanctity. Esdras, justice. The creation calls you God. Man calls you Father. But Solomon calls you compassion. And that is the most beautiful of all your names. Towards 9 o'clock in the evening, the 2 women retired. and betook themselves to their chambers on the first floor, leaving him alone until morning on the ground floor. It is necessary that we should, in this place, give an exact idea of the dwelling of the Bishop of Johannes. Chapter 6. Who guarded his house for him. The house in which he lived consisted, as we have said, of a ground floor and 1 story above, 3 rooms on the ground floor, 3 chambers on the first, and an attic above. Behind the house was a garden, 1/4 of an acre in extent. The 2 women occupied the first floor. The bishop was lodged below. The first room, opening on the street, served him as dining room. The second was his bedroom, and the third his oratory. There was no exit possible from his oratory, except by passing through the window, by passing through the bedroom, nor from the bedroom without passing through the dining room. At the end of the suite, in the oratory, there was a detached alcove with a bed, for use in cases of hospitality. The bishop offered this bed to country curates, who in business of the requirements of their parishes brought to Johannes. The pharmacy of the hospital, a small building which had been added to the house and abutted on the garden, had been transformed into a kitchen and cellar. In addition to this, there was in the garden a stable which had formerly been the kitchen of the hospital, and in which the bishop kept 2 cows. No matter what the quantity of milk they gave, he invariably sent half of it every morning to the sick people in the hospital. "I am paying my tithes," he said. His bedroom was tolerably large and rather difficult to warm in bad weather. As wood is extremely dear at Johannes, he hit upon the idea of having a compartment of boards constructed in the cowshed. Here he passed his evenings during seasons of severe cold. He called it his winter salon. In this winter salon, as in the dining room, there was no other furniture than a square table in white wood and 4 straw-seated chairs. In addition to this, the dining room was ornamented with an antique sideboard painted pink in watercolors. Out of a similar sideboard, properly draped with white napery and imitation lace, the bishop had constructed the altar which decorated his oratory. His wealthy penitents and the sainted women of Johannes had more than once assessed themselves to raise the money for a new altar for Monsignor's oratory. On each occasion, he had taken the money and had given it to the poor. The most beautiful of altars, he said, is the soul of an unhappy creature consoled and thanking God. In his oratory, there were 2 straw prie-dieu, and there was an armchair also in straw in his bedroom. When by chance he received 7 or 8 persons at one time, the prefect or the general or the staff of the regiment in garrison or several pupils from the little seminary, the chairs had to be fetched from the winter salon in the stable, the prie-dieu from the oratory, and the armchair from the bedroom. In this way, as many as 11 chairs could be collected for the visitors. A room was dismantled for each new guest. It sometimes happened that there were 12 in the party. The bishop then relieved the embarrassment of the situation by standing in front of the chimney if it was winter, or by strolling in the garden if it was summer. There was still another chair in the detached alcove, but the straw was half gone from it, and it had but 3 legs, so that it was of service only when propped against the wall. Mademoiselle Baptistine had also in her own room a very large easy chair of wood, which had formerly been gilded, and which was covered with flowered pekins, but they had been obliged to hoist this bergère up to the first story through the window. As the staircase was too narrow, it could not, therefore, be reckoned among the possibilities in the way of furniture. Mademoiselle Baptistine's ambition had been to be able to purchase a set of drawing-room furniture in yellow Utrecht velvet, stamped with a rose pattern, and with mahogany in swan's neck style, with a sofa. But this would have cost 500 francs at least, and in view of the fact that she had only been able to lay by 42 francs and 10 sous for this purpose in the course of 5 years, she had ended by renouncing the idea. However, who is there who has attained his ideal? Thank you very much for listening. You've been listening to Les Misérables by Victor Hugo. My name is Toasting, and this is BigBooksCPK.com. Thank you very much, and bye for now.